And it's a pleasure to welcome you today to our session entitled The Future of Aid in the Post-COVID-19 Context. Challenges and opportunities. We will be discussing challenges and opportunities when it comes to aid. And as you know, the issues that we will be discussing are extremely timely, thinking about the COVID context and the relevance of official development assistance for the poorest countries. This session, it's part of ODAODA's Policy Forum 2021. And it's also a pleasure for me to host this session today and see the great interest that we have in our community to discuss issues like this. We got more than 90 people registered for this session with colleagues from North and South. So we are very excited about this session. There is interpretation available in French and Spanish. You can find the icon at the bottom of your screen. So please make good use of that. Thanks the interpreters for working with us today. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website soon. So you will all have the chance to watch it again. We would also like to thank our donors for their support to run this policy forum and this session in particular. So our thanks go to Bread for the World, the European Union, and the Gates Foundation. Going into the dynamics of today's session, I would like to welcome our speakers today. I will introduce them now, and then before giving them the floor, I will also say a couple of words to introduce their interventions. We will first hear from Ricardo Roba. He's policy and advocacy advisor, among other things, for Concord, and among other things, he coordinates Concord's annual Aid Watch report on European Union official development assistance, and he also supports the work of Concord on financing and funding for sustainable development. We will so welcome Ricardo, and thanks for being with us today. Then we will hear from Vitalis Meja. Meja is seasoned development professional with over 20 years of experience in development work, currently working as the executive director of the Reality of Aid Africa. Meja has played a key role in positioning African civil society organizations in the development finance scene. Thanks, Meja, for being with us today. It's a pleasure, as always, to interact with you on these and other issues. Then I would like to welcome Samantha Asrich. She is a senior research fellow and development finance specialist at the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, with a particular interest in innovative and blended finance, development finance institutions, national development banks. Again, Samantha, it's great to have you here with us today. Very much looking forward to your contributions into this discussion. And finally, I would like to welcome a friend of ODAODA, my former ODAODA colleague, Jeroen Quackenbos. He is now Deputy Head of Oxfam EU Advocacy Office and Senior Aid Policy and Development Finance Advisor at Oxfam International. He works on European Union and multilateral development finance. And within this field, he leads Oxfam work on the intersection between aid and private finance. And again, it's a pleasure to have a friend as Sharon in this panel. As you probably seen in the invitation to this session, we invited Adrian Chico-Warrior from AfroDAD to participate in this discussion, but unfortunately he's unwell today, so he sent us his apologies. We hope that we will have the chance to hear or to read AfroDAD's views on this particular topic in the coming weeks. So watch out this space. AfroDAD, it's a partner of ODAODAODA, and we really want to have their views into this conversation. Okay, so now about what we are going to have today. So the structure of the webinar, it's the following. We will have the interventions of each of the speakers, followed by comments and questions. My ODAODAD colleague, Nerea Cravioto, Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer at ODAODAD, doing work on aid effectiveness, will moderate the questions that come. And we will also be adding some questions and remarks to move the content of the discussion. I take this opportunity to thank Nerea for organizing this session and for being so active in this field. So please submit your questions and comments through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You will also have the chance to vote for the questions already available according to your preferences. So I think that I have done quite a lot of the formal part in terms of presenting this panel. I did not spend quite a lot of time introducing the topic because I think that it's good that we take this time to hear from our guest speakers. I could just say that, as I said at the beginning, the issue of official development assistance, it's an issue that ODAODAD has been working on for many years. In the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, the value of official development assistance, it's something that has to be highlighted, has to be strengthening. There is a very important role for ODA to play in the current context, in the benefits of the poorest and most vulnerable. ODAODAD published last week a report that highlights one of the many different threats that come to the issue of official development assistance, and in this case is the issue of Tidal. But I am sure that our guest speakers will also be able to name other threats and other challenges that come to this specific agenda, and also other opportunities that for sure arise in the current context when it comes to emphasizing the value of official development assistance and thinking about how we can support and strengthen a discussion that focus on that. Without further ado, I will give the floor to our speakers. And as I said, Ricardo Roba from Concord will have the floor first for 8 minutes. And he will focus his intervention on the European Union and the Team Europe's approach to the issue of official development assistance, with some of the findings that come from the last Concord AidWatch report. So Ricardo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And yeah, let's just me say thank you to ODAODAD to organize this panel discussion, which is indeed extremely timely. Now I will try to share my screen since I prepared just a few slides to guide the discussion a bit. Do you see my screen? Yes, okay. So thank you, Maria Jose. As you were saying, I will focus my presentation on some lessons learned from the EU ODA level. Because yes, I work in Concord Europe, I deal with the Aid Watch report, but also because the EU is still the biggest block of ODA donors, meaning that trends that are happening at the EU level have an impact on, or may have an impact on other donors too. So my presentation will be focused on some of the changes, some of the most important changes that have happened recently in the EU ODA landscape. One of them being the shift from development cooperation to international partnerships. The second point indeed will be about Team Europe approach and initiatives. I'll try to explain a bit better what these approach and initiatives are and what these mean in terms of trends in the EU ODA landscape. And then I will briefly touch upon the new EU budget for external action, the Global Europe instrument. The findings that I will share today come from the Aid Watch report that we just released in October, Geopolitical Commission, Building Partnerships or Playing Politics. This is the title of the report. So in terms of shift to international partnership, at the Brussels level, we have seen a shift from development cooperation to international partnerships. Already in 2019, the Commissioner for Development Cooperation changed her title into Commissioner for International Partnerships. And since January 2021, also in the Commission, the Directorate General DG DEFCO became DG INTPA. Is this a change only in the language, in the words? Well, this change also comes with a change narrative with the European Commission saying that the European Union has to play as a geopolitical actor in a more geopolitical world. There are more references to investments, to private sector, to partnership in that sense in many of the documents that the European Union more and more produces. As civil society, as Concord, we have been quite critical of this change. Of course, we've welcomed partnerships if this means partnership with civil society, partnership with least developed countries, partnership in a development effectiveness agenda language. Critical, of course, of what I was saying before, the partnerships in terms of investment, blending, and private sector. This first change to international partnerships also came with new geopolitical priorities of the European Commission in the external action that are the ones that you can see here. EU Green Deal, digitalization, growth and jobs, governance, peace and security, and migration and mobility. These 5 geopolitical priorities should be mainstreamed throughout the whole EU external action, including in the aid policy. Team Europe approach. So Team Europe approach is another big shift, a big change that we've seen recently in the EU ODA policy. Team Europe approach was initially created to provide a united, coordinated response of the European Union globally, a response to the COVID-19 pandemic in partner countries. However, over the last year and a half, it has evolved into something else, into a more comprehensive approach. And in practical, it's been translated into these Team Europe initiatives. The Team Europe initiatives, according again to the main narrative, have several objectives. One of them pushing, of course, the leading role of the European Union on the global stage in the international fora. Another one is to rebrand the EU ODA and give more visibility about the EU and member states ODA. And the last but not least is to increase coherence and coordination between EU donors and mobilize bigger financial volumes. The Team Europe initiatives are flagship initiatives. There will be 2 for each partner country, also at the regional level and at the global level. They will have to fit somehow into the EU programming, so into the so-called multi-annual indicative programs, and therefore be linked with the geopolitical objectives that I was mentioning before. However, we know very little still about the implementation of the TIs. So in the last DidWatch report, we have tried to analyze and measure the Team Europe approach against the commitment of Team Europe to the effectiveness development agenda. Of course, it's a very preliminary assessment, meaning that we will have to wait the implementation of Team Europe initiatives to understand how effective these Team Europe initiatives are. But basing our analysis on Council conclusions that were already adopted in 2020, on a guide that the Commission published last year, and on questionnaires that we carried out also at the national level, we can say that the picture doesn't sound too positive. We've tried to give a color code assessment. So you can see green means a strong commitment to each of the development effectiveness principle. Amber means that some adjustments are needed, and red that the level of commitment are very low. You can see again that the picture is not super positive, especially, let me just spend a couple of words in terms of ownership. Unfortunately, even if there are references to the national development strategies of partner countries, in the making of the Team Europe initiatives, there was not a specific moment and obligation for the Team Europe initiative to include those objectives from national development strategies. In terms of transparency, TIs are not doing very well. We know that the European Commission is working on some IT tools to make information regarding TIs more accessible in terms of funding, in terms of objective, in terms of stakeholders involved. But so far, also, if you look randomly on internet about Team Europe initiatives, the information is extremely limited. And if it's extremely limited for us in Brussels, we can only imagine the situation is even worse for civil society, local civil society in partner countries. What we know so far about Team Europe initiatives, let me just say that Team Europe initiatives are in the making, so more will come. They are approved by batches, and this data is based on the first 2 batches. We know from yesterday actually that a third batch was approved, and therefore, but they didn't have the time to update the numbers, so bear with me. However, the third batch is also in line with the picture portrayed here. Most of the Team Europe initiatives are from the Sub-Saharan Africa. About a third of the Team Europe initiatives will be implemented in the Latin American and the Caribbean region, and smaller parts in the Asian Pacific and Middle East. The EU member states' involvement varies very much, with Germany and France. I mean, it's also normal to think that Germany and France are the biggest contributors to EU donors, EU ODA, which means, for obvious reasons, they are involved in most of the EU member states. The Netherlands and Spain still in more than half of the TIs, and all other member states in much lower numbers. These, of course, put into question the emphasis of Team Europe as a whole. In Team Europe initiatives, also financial institutions can take part in the planning and implementation. The European Investment Bank is, for example, involved in almost 90% of the TIs, and also Member States Development Bank. You can see AfD, for example, is involved in more than a half of the TIs. Here you can see the policy priorities for overall the TIs. The policy priorities of the TIs are overlap with the 5 geopolitical objectives. However, you could see on the left, the last column about human development. So as civil society, as Concord, we raised the message that TEIs were not doing enough about human development. The 5 geopolitical objectives are not tackling human development as standalone priority. The response from the Commission was that to mainstream as much as possible human development as a sector. Almost last slide is about the EU budget. From this year, 2021, there is a new cycle of the EU budget for the next 7 years, so 2021 to 2027. For the European Union external action, we have a new instrument, which is not the only instrument, but it's the biggest instrument the European Union has as aid instrument. The novelties are that it is a single instrument compared to more than 10 instruments from the previous cycle. On a positive note, the Global Europe Instrument has very ambitious aid targets. One, for example, on human development, so 20% of the overall instrument should be spent on human development, 30% on climate. One less positive, ambitious target, I would say, is the 10% for migration spending. It is a geographical instrument. 75% of the funding goes to geographic programs.
Sorry, Ricardo, just to flag that you have 1 minute to wrap up.
Thank you, sorry. The instrument is a very flexible instrument, which comes also with some concerns from civil society that flexibility may mean that implementation would go more for highly political debated objectives. One positive side is that the European Parliament has an oversight scrutiny role on the Global Europe spending. However, so far, the European Parliament has acted in a, let's say, weird way, in the sense that a lot of debates about Global Europe Instrument, programming, and so on have been held in camera, meaning that the general public and CSOs could not follow the debate. And last but not least, more blending finance, more emphasis on private sector financing in this instrument. Just to wrap up, for the international partnerships, this shift is somehow welcome, but we need to make sure that partnership also means partnership with civil society, partnership with least developed countries, and that we talk about fair and equal partnerships. Team Europe, we should raise the question, what is new compared to already existing instrument that the European Commission had in terms of joint programming, in terms of joint implementation, rather than rebranding EU ODA. The Team Europe should do better and more on human development, not only as a mainstream activity, but as a targeted sector as well. And Team Europe approach and initiatives show that the European Union aims to go big with big flagship initiatives, big investments in infrastructures, big projects, also with the role of the AB. Global Europe Instrument is in line with recent years. Some aid trends will be reinforced, like conditionality on migration. We also did a paper on that in May. And some of these trends, the most worrisome trends, need to be closely monitored by civil society. Thank you so much, and sorry if it took a bit longer.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Ricardo, for your remarks. It's very interesting and relevant for us to see the findings of the EdWatch report and to have Concord engagement in this discussion. I will now give the floor to Vitalis Meja from Reality of Aid Africa. Meja is going to share his perspective on the aid trends he's seeing in the African region, reflecting on what type of aid is Africa actually receiving and what type of aid Africa might need. You will have your 8 minutes. I will warn you when you have just 1 minute to wrap up your remarks. So once again, welcome, Meja, to this session. The floor is yours. Meja? Are you there?
Yes, I am here. I'm just having some technological challenges. I hope I can make it.
That's fine. Please go ahead. Welcome.
I'm being asked to show my video. It may disconnect, so, but let's see if it works. So let me begin by thanking Eurodat for organizing this event. I think it is very timely and indeed very useful. Unfortunately, like Ricardo, I don't have any slides to share, but I have some ideas I want to put across, especially on this topic, and particularly with the focus on the African side, looking at the question of, how are things panning out, and how do we see things going forward, especially with regard to the COVID scenario. So let me just begin. I was asked to try to look at the figures, but I declined to do that for two reasons. One is it is not very easy to get the statistics now because most governments are not receiving ODA through their country systems. They are not able to capture data because a lot of the support is either passed through COVAX. We are just told the figures, but really government can only capture what passes through the national budget. So if we are to relate that with the principles that guide development effectiveness or development operation, I would say that a couple of things have happened. One, since COVID, the application of Busan principles have been suspended, albeit especially with regard to donor approaches. And we see this in two aspects. One is we don't see development partners. Let me use donors to make it easy for me. Donors are not using country systems. As a matter of fact, most of the ODA now is channeled either through a COVAX facility or a United Nations facility to support either COVID-related programs. And so we are experiencing a lack of country ownership. And the reason why that is so is because at one point I was talking to one of government officials and she was explaining that, look, it is all good to get this ODA through COVAX stuff, but, for example, now we have too many face masks, but we'd rather, for instance, direct our energies towards buying the freezers. And we cannot buy those because we are not carrying resources to determine priority areas that we like to spend on. So there is a really compromised capacity of countries to plan and prioritize their own response and plan their own future because of where the resources are not being driven. I'm not saying that, in essence, that it's ODA that is supposed to determine how government organize plan. But as you may know, this disease does not emerge from here. It is a pandemic that came from somewhere else. So it only added an extra burden, and an extra burden that had serious implication on the economy. So with regard to that particular aspect, the issue of country ownership, the issue of transparency and accountability on how these resources are being used or consumed, particularly by development partners providing them, it is not very clear. The data may be in the north, and they know how much they're spending, but governments who are receiving these resources don't really know. They only know, for example, that they will get X number amount of vaccines. And I think all of us have seen scenarios where countries end up returning these vaccines because they might expire. And somebody might think they must be crazy. But at the same time, we have to try to think why that is so. Because you have vaccines, but you can store them, or you don't have the right syringes to use or the right needles to use. And therein brings the issue of the Tidal aid that you have spoken about. Because we are actually experiencing the normalization of Tidal aid. Countries are not being provided tools, instruments, and technology to be able to manufacture or produce, materials and let's say medicine or whatever that could help them fight the pandemic. And you see through this because most of the global effort has been towards responding to the pandemic. But we've reached a scenario where we have to wait to be given. At one point, it was 6 months when the vaccinations had been rolled out, and not a single one had started enough. Because we were waiting. We were waiting for everybody else to do their part, and yet we are not able to move. So the Tidal aid part, and that, sorry, let me still belabor on this point. Maybe I'm hitting too much, but you see, even when India stepped up to provide some support, and China, these vaccines were not recognized in Europe. And you saw how much, whatever it raised, that only vaccine that came from Europe or America would be recognized if the Africans or other people from developing countries used those ones. So you see the tying of aid is really becoming normal now. And everybody, including citizens, would in fact agree with the politicians or government officials. Yes, they should have, we can only verify what we have produced. So there is that element that we need to really talk about. Secondly, is the issue of the reemergence of conditionality. As somebody said, the EU has become, it is not, but it is a multilateral institution. So it's something that we have to think about, because most bilaterals are also putting their resources to that, the TEI that Ricardo was talking about. But the same is also, most European governments are now channeling their resources to World Bank and IMF for reforming and restructuring the economies. And we are seeing so many conditionalities being reintroduced because of the so-called debt distress, because of the so-called that the pandemic has hit us, now things have to be looked at differently. So you see, ODA at the moment is being used to not only promote the aid dependency, because by telling us that we have to get only vaccine from Europe or America, what are you trying to say? That we have to be dependent on those facilities. By telling us that we have to reorganize our economies in a certain way. So what exactly are we promoting? Those are the dependencies that are coming back that we have to think through. But largely, it's really the question of, the private sector driven, private sector agenda driven ODA that we are also experiencing. So while Maria Jose, you are grappling with PSI, on this side, I'm grappling with PPP policies. You understand? Because all of them look the same, because they were designed by a World Bank expert or consultant. And you see in those policies, the voice of public institutions or governments are increasingly being muzzled out to give preference and enable investment by the private sector. And all this is being done in order to enable the small ODA as a catalyst to come and enable this process. And of course, I think you saw from what Ricardo presented, the graph on climate Green Deal. So we are actually going to expect a lot of climate finance driven, private sector driven agenda that we really have to think through and its implication going forward. And that is not to mean that ODA is not important, it's all evil. The question we have to think about is whether in its current format, it serves the purpose of humanitarian and development agenda that is needed. So that's something that we have to think about. I see Maria was just giving me the face, you need to hurry up, so I'm going to do that. I think one thing that I have, the only positive thing I could say about what is going on is certainly for the citizen and the most vulnerable initiatives that previously, that got ODA, especially those who are getting the HIV drugs, those who are getting the TB drugs, those who are getting the insulin, at least those programs are still supported by donor. Because government priority has been towards, responding to the pandemic, and as such, these are not really a priority at the moment. So I think it is really for us now to start thinking the bigger picture on not getting into the polemics of arguing with EU and whoever else, but really changing the discussion and saying, look, wait a minute, this framework is not working. How can we put in a new architecture? And I'll be happy to have that discussion. I thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Meja, for these remarks. I extremely, I value extremely the points that you raised, because this comes to complement some of the things that, as you say, we are seeing in some of the global discussions, some of the discussions that we are having with northern governments, but from the other side. So your perspective, it's very valuable. So I would like to give now the floor to Samantha. Sorry. Samantha's intervention will focus on development finance, institutions, investment, and she will share some reflections regarding aid in this specific context, while addressing the role of the donor community as well. She has been doing quite a lot of research in this field. ODI has been very active in discussions on this. So once again, it's a pleasure to have you here. You have the floor, Samantha.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and I enjoyed very much listening to Meja's presentation, and I think I might touch on some of these issues around, I think, the kind of the dilution of aid, what it means, and statistical standards towards the end of my remarks. So I think what I'm going to do, I don't have a PowerPoint, but bored of doing those, I'm going to start by making two brief contextual reflections, which I think it might be useful for us to reflect on, which can help further strengthen and sharpen, I think, the advocacy of civil society, before probably outlining briefly three policy issues, I think, in this area for civil society's attention. So my first contextual reflection is actually around the framing of the debate. So, I'm really thinking around this issue around the use of aid to mobilize private investment. Some people call it blended, subsidization, and there's lots of issues there, as we know, about definitions and things. So maybe what I'm going to, so that's what I'm going to talk about. So I think first we probably need to stand back just a little bit and reflect on what I think is becoming, or is quite a polarized framing of the debate, which often, I think, crudely pictures aid investment to mobilize private investment against traditional aid investment, as if these two forms, and this is the important thing, as if these two forms of investment are perfect substitutes for each other, when they're not. As we know, they're two actually fundamentally different forms of investment with different impact pathways and impacts. But also, I think the two forms of investment can actually be very complementary and mutually reinforcing. And so I think it's just important at the outset also just to stand back and think, we're not comparing apples with apples. So setting that up like that, I don't think is the right way to frame this debate. What we need to really be focusing is kind of the value for money of of investing aid in different ways, and in this way, if you like, in blending aid. And herein, I think, lies the problem, is that we just simply don't understand what the value for money of this approach is. We don't know in any meaningful or comparable way what it costs, i.e. what the input is, and on the output side, what the associated impact is. And so we can't assess value for money. And I think here there's a major issue around the lack of common conceptual, definitional and measurement frameworks, and of course, very poor data, which hinders kind of transparency and accountability. And in my view, ultimately undermines effective policy making and public trust in this approach. So that's my first I think, reflection, kind of contextual reflection. My second one is, I guess, a little bit of just to kind of temper and nuance some of the discussion. Because I think just as we saw, we've seen a tempering, I think, about the potential of blended finance, the billions to trillions rhetoric. I mean, many of you will have known and seen my work about leverage ratios, where the latest, I think it's at 69 cents on the dollar. So we've I think we've tempered the expectation of donors about actually how much this approach is going to contribute to that agenda. But I think we may also need to anchor the worry that the DAC reform of ODA is going to result in a material diversion of aid. Because I think if you look at the statistics, this hasn't actually materialized yet. In 2020, bilateral PSI investment totaled 3.2 billion, accounting for just under 2% of ODA. And that's actually a small decline from the 3.4 billion in 2019. So the floodgates, at least on the bilateral side, I would say, haven't been opened, counter to what some commentators, I think, and including myself, especially in the early days, feared. But that's not to say that it might not happen in the future. It's obviously something we need to keep an eye on, especially as donor budgets come under pressure. But I think we need to be, measured in terms of the amount of money that we're talking about at this moment in time. Although those numbers, I think, do probably underestimate the amount of aid that's invested this way, because it's not clear, for example, how MDB and RDB replenishments, which are channeled to private sector window operations, are counted, for example. So those are my two I think, things we should stand back and think about to sharpen our kind of argument and debate. So in terms of policy issues, the first, I think, is that we need a much better understanding of the impact of blending on poverty reduction. And I think at the outset, it's important to remember that not all DFI investments, sometimes I think some of these debates, we kind of talk in general terms, not all DFI investment is funded by aid. And in fact, it's actually a very small subset of their operations. So I think we need to be clear what it is that we're talking about. And I mention this because I think that the actual ask then, in terms of impact, would probably be differentiated depending on the source of the funding. So if aid is being used, and it is, of course, I think it is justified to demand more on the poverty front if we are using aid to invest in this way. But if its investment is financed from debt, which is issued in capital markets, so many DFIs actually fund their operations from commercial debt, then the immediate kind of objective might be slightly different. So again, I think there's a little bit of room for nuance here in terms of kind of what we're asking for, dependent on the source of funding. And again, the problem here is transparency. Of that 3.2 billion that was accounted for as PSI in 2020, we can't actually see how that 3.2 billion has been invested, and we can't see the impact. So I think that we need, if we are going to use aid this way, I'm not going to take a view on whether we should or not. I think it's reasonable that we should expect a greater focus on investment that demonstrably supports poor people, for example, by increasing their incomes through job creation, improving the quality of their jobs, or reducing the price of goods and services that are consumed by the poor. The problem is that we just don't understand the distributional impact of this. And I think we can just quickly think about the issue of job creation. I mean, job creation is one of the key kind of impact objectives for all DFIs. And jobs are critical. They're a main route out of poverty. and they're mainly created in the private sector. So there's no doubt kind of the importance of this agenda. And there's no doubt in all the work that I've done that DFI investment creates jobs. But the problem is we don't actually know about the distributional impact. So who got the job? What was its quality? What was the circumstance, etc., to understand then how this investment is impacting poverty. So of course, you know, I'm a big advocate for the development of theories of change to inform investment to really actively target poverty reduction ex ante and report and evaluate it properly ex post to better inform future investment. So the first thing is we need to really home in, if we're going to use aid this way, on its impact on poverty and better target it. My second issue, policy issue, if we're going to use aid this way, is we need a much better approach, both in terms of the targeting, which I've spoken about, but also the actual investment approach. And I think that we're at a critical inflection point here. The bottom line is, in my view, pouring more aid money into DFIs without fundamental change in how they invest is not going to deliver the results we want to see. So I think we need to argue for change. And I think that the discussion needs to move to, or pivot to, how do we invest aid to optimize impact for the poorest people in the poorest countries? And I should say, you know, I'm not civil society, I'm a development economist, and I do believe there are strong economic arguments to subsidize private investment in certain countries, sectors, and circumstances. But the problem again is that I feel there's a disconnect between the investment patterns we would expect to see from theory to those that we actually see in practice. And some examples of this, you know, we see very little of the aid which is blended allocated to subsidize investment in, you know, to support growth in the poorest countries. We know that agriculture is very important for poverty reduction, but again, little is invested in agriculture. We know that labor absorbing manufacturing can create large numbers of jobs for less skilled workers, but again, little is invested in that. And then if we think around climate change, you know, little is invested, I would argue, in pioneering kind of technologies, those frontier technologies that we need, or business models in hard to decarbonize sectors. You know, investment instead is concentrated in, if you like, the more established renewable technologies, arguably the low-hanging fruit. So that's the investment pattern. Sorry, I will.
Just to say that you have one minute to wrap up.
Oh, okay. So those are kind of the patterns don't match what the theory would, the theory underpinning, if you like, the argument to do this. And secondly, the approach, I think, is also problematic because a large part of this is deployed in the form of senior debt rather than high-risk capital, which limits its catalytic effect. And investment, I would argue, is often opportunistic rather than coordinated and strategic. So I think we need to make better use of it. And I've got just 4 quick ideas, and I'll quickly just finish with a comment on transparency. We need to use, if we're going to use it, we need to use more of it in low-income countries vis-a-vis upper middle-income countries. We need to use more of it in high-risk capital. We need to use more of it to fund project preparation and early stage to development to address bottlenecks. Importantly, we need a better complementarity between traditional aid and subsidized investment. So coordinating policy work with investment. And finally, I'm just going to make some quick comments on transparency. I think I've indicated here that, you know, throughout the issue around transparency, first, there's a massive issue around the lack of DFI transparency and harmonization. You know, we just don't understand kind of what they're doing, if you like, on the input and the output side. And I think that's got to be the first starting point. So here, a big shout out to the work of Publish What You Fund, who've tackled this issue. They've developed a tool, I'm sure you've seen it. And I think civil society should be teaming up with them to apply pressure for DFIs to adopt and operationalize these two tools. So far, only EBRD and USDFC have done it. The second, and I think this is a real, picking up on Mejé's point, I'm borrowing a term of a friend of mine at ODI. I think the OECD DAC has become a bit of a Wild West in terms of what ODA is. And there's a massive issue here around kind of transparency and a dilution of statistical standards. Again, borrowing from my colleagues, you know, basically gimmickry has appeared as the order of the day to maximize the amount of ODA that we record for minimal fiscal outlay and donor effort. And I really feel that the clarity, the integrity, and the credibility of ODA is being undermined. And if we look, 2 seconds, if we look at the private sector instruments, is such a good example of this. So much has been left on temporary review with a very real risk that inertia, these kind of unsatisfactory temporary holding positions will become permanent. And these positions go right against good statistical practice, even the OECD's good statistical practice. They've introduced inconsistency on so many levels, and I won't go into all the ins and outs. But I really do believe that this should be a major concern of civil society, and that I'm not sure who's who's leading this, but I think, as I say, it builds up on Mej's point. There's something happening at the DAC which is threatening the credibility of ODA, and I think civil society needs to pick this issue up. That's the end. Sorry.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Samantha, for your remarks. Very interesting points that you put on the table, and I think that the final points that you raise will tie very nicely with what Jeroen has to say, because he will be speaking on the trends observed in the aid field, the incentives that we have seen in the last years, and will provide some insights on the recent discussions at the DAC and their impact in the quality of aid, and some of the things that you mentioned. I'm sure that will be addressed by Jeroen. So Jeroen, you have your 8 minutes. I will flag to you when time is up. The floor is yours. Welcome again.
Thank you very much, Maria Jose. So yes, as mentioned, I will first give a snapshot of where we are in aid with the most recent figures from 2020, then go a little bit into how the sausage is made and how it distorts actually the credibility of aid. And then if there's time, a little bit into risk transfer mechanisms, which is a part of the discussion of the potential future of aid. So where we are in broad terms is in 2020, the preliminary ODA figures were estimated to be at about 161.2 billion, which was the global equivalent of 0.32% GNI of the OECD DAC donor community. If donors had reached 0.7% in 2020, that amount would be 352.6 billion. Now, this is a very important number because at the beginning of the COVID crisis, the UN, through UNCTAD, called for an initial investment of 500 billion in aid in order to help LDCs and middle-income countries battle the impacts of the COVID pandemic. Now, Oxfam has estimated on the basis of GNI, global GNI share, that for the OECD DAC community of that 500 billion, they would be up for donating roughly about 300 billion. So if they had actually met the 0.7% target, we would have fully funded a UN response that they had seen was necessary at the time to deal with the COVID crisis. The impact of the COVID crisis on official development assistance has been quite clear. Many donors, where possible, reoriented their investment to health systems, food security, and increases in humanitarian aid. And there was a COVID marker added to most donors' ODA reporting, which means that they wanted to see how much they were spending on ODA by making sure that it was aligned to dealing with the COVID crisis. This produced mixed results, as for many donors, suddenly everything they did was somehow relevant to COVID. I think the EU is an example where of the 15 billion they spent in 2020, something like 14 billion of it somehow was COVID relevant, which is just not particularly credible, because they did not think about this before, and how you plan ODA spending the year before means that it's very unlikely that they had this in mind. And that gets a little bit into some of the inconsistencies in the reporting exercise. It also demonstrated that ODA continues to be reactive rather than transformational. It often tends to respond to emerging political crises of the moment rather than having long-term development as an actual objective. the impact of COVID would probably have been significantly less in partner countries if we had been serious about implementing the lessons learned from the Ebola crisis in terms of strengthening health systems and actually investing in countries' ability to deal with the immediate needs of their citizens in terms of public health. That year, we also saw a significant increase in the usage of loans and other non-grant-based instruments. And this is particularly due to a massive increase in the amount of ODA that went to upper middle income countries, which are usually the largest recipients of these types of instruments. As Samantha mentioned before, there is value to things like investment, equity, and loans, but for the most part, they tend to go to low-hanging fruit projects and to countries which actually need them the least, rather than countries which could benefit them the most. That being said, it is very important to note that in 2020, ODA was the only global and domestic financial resource that was stable or increased during the COVID crisis. FDI went down, domestic taxation went down. So for the most part, ODA still was quite important, especially for the poorest countries. Moving on now to incentives in ODA reporting, which gets a little bit into Sam's last point. The reporting and eligibility rules that govern official development assistance can have all kinds of incentives, from perverse to productive, and really influence the type and quality of interventions that donors prioritize. Incentives are highly speculative, so that's something that you should be made aware of. It's not often clear if you can prove how these incentives have actually impacted aid. But for the most part, they do have a distortionary effect in terms of how donors utilize their ODA and in what capacity and what form. I'm going to give a couple examples. So for many donor countries, there can be a political tension between treasury and development ministries or development agencies. Most development ministries, which have a 0.7% spending target, are the only agencies or ministries within a government that actually has to increase spending, whereas Treasury is usually focused primarily on decreasing government spending. That tension in and of itself can change the characteristic of ODA by prioritizing debt-based instruments and sovereign lending over grant.
Sorry, there is a problem with your sound, Jeroen.
Is this working now? Yes, okay, fantastic. Sorry about that, my charger fell out. The 0.7% target itself can have a perverse incentive because once a metric becomes a target, it pretty much ceases to be useful as a metric. This is particularly seen in the case of the UK, which laudably passed the 0.7% law to meet its commitment. However, it viewed that commitment as a ceiling rather than a floor, which meant that any changes to policy priorities had an opportunity cost to existing expenditure. And this will particularly be the case in future discussions related to vaccine donations and SDRs, where if any of that amount counts as ODA, that means there will be less ODA for other things. And this creates a distortionary effect, and is a clear example of a perverse incentive in action, where something that is supposed to be positive can lead to negative behaviors within how governments use ODA. The results of these types of incentives usually lead to an everything but the kitchen sink, or even the kitchen sink approach to ODA reporting. For the most part, donors will try and report everything they can get away with as ODA in order to meet political targets like the 0.7% target. And this can have a distortionary effect in terms of what is actually considered good ODA and what is just bloat, or just put in there because they've managed to get away with it and sneak it past the OECD DAC. It is important to note that ODA reporting is a voluntary exercise. Governments can choose what they do and do not report as ODA. They don't have to report everything that is eligible within the rules as ODA. An example of this is Luxembourg, which during the recent migration crisis decided not to report in-donor refugee costs as ODA because they did not consider that as being relevant to the welfare of partner countries. And therefore, they took a principled stand on ODA reporting based upon their own internal development principles. This is very rare. It does not happen very often. For the most part, donors will report everything they can get away with reporting. The ODA modernization process, which started in 2014, was initially supposed to deal with some of the most egregious examples of these negative incentives, primarily through reforming how ODA loans were reported. There was basically a long period of time where donors could make significant money off of ODA loans and still report them as ODA, despite them being much higher in terms of interest rate than the market is asking for, which means that they're not particularly concessional. And then there was a strange situation where donors could actually borrow from capital markets and then on lend to the poorest countries and make a significant profit off of those loans, which once again raised questions as to the nature of concessionality. While it has to a degree address the issue of loans, it did open the door for it opened the door for donors to try and sneak in other gaming behaviors and opportunities to try and increase their ODA levels through minimal fiscal cost. There has been to date a significant blurring of the lines between what could be considered development and what could be considered global public goods. It is important that these two things are not mixed, because if we start incorporating global public goods into ODA reporting, then basically almost everything and anything can be included in there, and it ceases to have any value as a development metric. And the modernization process, while it is ongoing and it has fixed some elements related to loans, we've already seen some negative results, such as the reporting of debt relief, which could potentially down the line lead to significant inflation of ODA levels. And to my mind, at least counts as double counting of ODA as, from very specific technical terms, as far as I can tell, the risk is already in the loans, in the grant element structure of how loans are issued. So it really is a case of double reporting and having your cake and eat it too. Taken to an extreme, there is a real risk that the definition of ODA could become so incredibly bloated with all kinds of stuff and junk that it would be impossible to actually tell whether an increase in ODA actually led to increased resources for development, which would make the entire exercise essentially pointless. And it would take on more of a kind of ritualistic aspect rather than having any actual kind of meaningful indication of a country's progress in achieving development or of living up to commitments that donors have made to partner countries. It's pretty astounding that the rules that govern ODA reporting very rarely actually incorporates partner countries in terms of determining what those rules are. You would imagine that they would want to have some say in terms of what type of resources they need, what they think is fair and what they think is unfair. But for the most part, it has become incredibly clear over recent years that ODA is not really for partner countries. ODA is a metric for donor countries. It has almost nothing to do with development. It is an accounting tool. And as it continues to get bloated, becomes less and less relevant for partner countries. I mean, as Meja noted, he has no idea how much money went to Kenya, because what donors say on one end, we gave 100 billion in ODA, has very little meaning for the amount that actually went to partner countries. And this is a remarkable situation to be in, as this is how we are supposed to tell how we are making progress in terms of our ODA commitments and living up to what we agreed with partner countries.
You will have your 1 minute.
Fantastic. Okay. So, I mean, so in a way, ODA is supposed to keep donors' worst instincts in check. And it is currently being challenged by the OECD DAC and donor community. And it is, for the most part, on its way to becoming irrelevant in terms of actually having an impact on development cooperation and at risk of losing credibility in a very short period of time. And this has to do with all the kinds of external pressures around ODA. ODA is supposed to fix all the world's problems related to the SDGs. The SDG has a 3.5 trillion price tag. ODA is at 161 billion. You can see why there is a mismatch here and why there is pressure for things to be counted as ODA that otherwise might not be relevant to ODA in order to meet that price tag at minimal cost. I don't really have time to talk about risk transfer mechanisms, but just to note very quickly that there is now a discussion on what should be the future of ODA. This is Within Oxfam, this is a very contentious discussion. We have issues with ODA due to its colonial nature, due to dependency, due to the way that it's structured. But at the same time, there is without a doubt that ODA does a lot of good. And we need to really think about how do we reinforce the good that it does and try and mitigate some of the negative aspects that it does. And we are not the only ones thinking about this. And this relates to risk transfer in one particular way, is that there is one side of the donor community that really thinks that ODA should only be used for de-risking private investment, primarily from institutional investors like pension funds, because they are focused on that big money target of 3.5 trillion. And thinking that if they reach that target, then they will have met the needs of the SDGs, without actually thinking of the character of those interventions and whether or not they are developmental and what the actual impact are on the world's poorest people and countries. We can have more discussion on that during the following discussion if you want. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeroen, for your remarks. Very interesting points, particularly when it comes to some of the implications of the discussions going on at the DAC, and also your final points on the future of aid. And we are here also today to discuss about the future of aid, with some of the challenges that you all flagged and some of the opportunities that this discussion brings. So now I would like to open the conversation and to have a bit of an interaction with you, our guest speakers. And I would also like to encourage people that are with us today to send us your questions, your reflections. We do have quite a lot of participants in our virtual room. So please send us your reflections and your questions, and we will send these to our speakers. I would like to open this with a couple of questions to each of our speakers, and also encourage you to reflect and react on other people's remarks in the panel, because I do think that there is room for quite a lot of interaction and comments, because you all said quite interesting things that have to do with, as I said, the current situation, but also looking forward the future of aid. So I will start with my round of questions, and then I will open for your quick answers and reflections. So to Ricardo, I have a very specific question to you, and it's what does it mean for EU development cooperation that financial institutions and the European Investment Bank are so actively involved in Team Europe initiatives? We would like to hear some of your reflections on that, and as I said, if you do have some points to react to other people's questions. To Meja, I would like to build on some of the comments that were included in the chat. Thanks, Jacques Taggart, for your question, your point in the chat in reaction to Meja's point. So would you say that there is an emerging conditionality agenda under the ODA, climate finance, private sector nexus? Maybe it could be very useful for us to hear some of your reflections on that specific point, and see what else you would like to add to that specific point of your intervention. To Jeroen, I really would like to hear a bit more on your last point, because you did not have enough time to go into the risk management instrument. The DAC is looking into how to bring risk management instrument into the development cooperation field as a key instrument to incentivize the mobilization of private finance. What, in your view, could be the impact of these approaches to development cooperation and to aid in particular? And to Samantha, you flagged towards the end of your presentation the challenges that DFIs face when it comes to their practices, their transparency, accountability, also the lack of harmonization in their practices. You rightly pointed to the work that Public What You Found initiated in this field, but from your engagement with DFIs, what would you say that are the possibilities in that field? How can some principles be strengthening when it comes to DFIs? Just to hear your thought on that specific point. So I would open the floor to your answers to those questions and to your general reflections. Now we are a bit more limited in terms of time, so I would be a bit more strict, asking you to be brief in your answers. Going first to Ricardo. Ricardo, please.
Thank you, Michael. So yes, I will be very brief about your question on EIB and their involvement in the TIs. In my view, it says a lot about the nature of the project that Team Europe initiatives will be about. As I said, some of the objectives of these TIs are indeed to mobilize different development implementers, several development implementers from the EU side, which means the development agencies of member states, financial institutions, but also to mobilize big amount of funding. So in practical terms, I think, again, it speaks about the type of projects that TIs will be financed. EIB and the BRD are having a more and more active role in the EU development cooperation international policies. We could see it with the COVID response of the European Union at the global stage. We can see it also with the Global Europe Instrument, with the EFSD+. Many NGOs have been very vocal about the transparency, since we mentioned it already, the transparency about the way the EIB operates. The fact that EIB operates much more as an investment bank and not as a development bank, even if it has also development bank mandate, and they just announced recently that they will set up a new development branch. So this is something that we should also, as community of NGOs, follow closely. And there was another point that I wanted to say, but now it's in my mind. Apologies. But yeah, definitely the monitoring also of the implementation of TIs is something that we will need to closely monitoring, especially because of the implementation, because of the involvement of financial institutions like the EIB.
Okay, thanks very much, Ricardo, for these thoughts. It's very useful to guide things together. Meja, are you there? It would be great to hear from you on the question that I raised before.
Yeah, sure, I am still here. I think on the question of emerging conditionality, it's not really emerging, it's just now being done more broadly, and it is being accepted as the norm, which is different from when we were campaigning for debt cancellation and removal of conditionality. At least there was a step back. But now with this agenda of the reconstruction of economies after the COVID ravaging the revenue basis, and of course the issue of the debt distress, and also the exposure that COVID gave to middle-income economies, where now they're actually in the country, they're about to default in their debt service. Best way the world is responding the best way they know how. That is sending the bank and the fund to fix the problem, and the bank and the fund come in with specific prescriptions. And because countries are in dire need of these resources in order to balance their fiscus, we are now seeing them being very bold. And the challenge I have for us is the way we as civil society are quickly to move towards just, looking at the minute details on what is dangerous and what is wrong, having that technical discussion, instead of going political, no conditionalities, period. Because we know what these have done to our economy. That I think right now, I would say that the only emergence I see there is the boldness of both of these two very strong global institutions, and African governments not having power to deal with it. Lastly, on the private sector, I think, yes, private sector is part and parcel of this deal. Because you may remember that before even COVID happened, the PPP was a big agenda, and largely because of what also Jeroen talked about, that most of these economies that now acquire the status of borrowing resources from the global capital markets. And so private sector became a very big factor. But increasingly, as we move towards the Green Deal, private sector is going to be a very major implementer of this agenda. And in that regard, we have to see that conditionalities are also going to be enabling for this kind of investments and partnerships to take shape. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meja. I could now give the floor to Samantha, please.
Thank you. Yes, just briefly. Gosh, lots of reflections on the question. I might just focus on a couple of things. So first, I think what you asked about, kind of this issue around transparency, lack of harmonization, publish what you find, kind of what are the possibilities. I mean, just standing back, one of the big things I think and possibilities is to broker some kind of agreement on the conceptual framework of what we mean by blended finance. And here, what I mean is the OECD have defined it in a particular way that those who actually do it, i.e. the DFIs and MDBs, don't agree. They don't recognize how the OECD have defined it. And then this leads to all sorts of kind of complication and diverging measurement kind of frameworks, definitions, and data. And so I think it's got to be possible that between them they can work something out. So at least we're starting on the same hymn page and talking about the same thing. So for me, that's a really important kind of possibility there. And secondly, I think there is on the publish what you find, I mean, there is, what we've seen is, there's so much, if you look at this publish what you fund tool, there's a vast array of kind of core and secondary information and at the organizational level and project level. And I think we probably need to prioritize kind of what's the most important information that we need. What is clear is that DFIs hide behind this issue around commercial confidentiality. And to be honest with you, I just don't think that this stands at all. And this is what the DFI, the Publish What You Fund tool, has investigated and challenged, because the situation is even in some core basic information where some DFIs will say, we're not providing you with that. Other DFIs are. They do the same thing. So, if it's possible for at least 2 DFIs to do, it should be possible for all of them to do. And so I think, I haven't studied in detail their tool, but I think we need to prioritize those kind of, if you like, the low-hanging fruits, if you like. Unfortunately, it's kind of the lowest common denominator, but it's a starting, it's a starting point, and we need to be realistic that this is a journey that's going to take time. So I think the kind of lowest common denominators. So look at some DFIs which have the best kind of disclosure at the moment, and then at least bring all the others up to that level at the moment. And as I say, hiding behind commercial confidentiality just does not stack up. There's an example I'm going to give, and it just frustrates me. When you look at the mobilization numbers, which are reported by the MDBs and DFIs versus what's reported to the OECD, is at least kind of double what the OECD reports. And you just don't know what to make of that. Now, the IFC basically refused, gave the OECD one number for its mobilization. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was like 2 billion or something like that. I can't remember, don't quote me on it. And they just gave the one number. They wouldn't disaggregate it by sector, by country, and I just don't understand what commercial confidentiality is breached by doing that, given that other multilaterals and other DFIs are disaggregating the data that they're providing. So I think there's probably a little bit of, perhaps, again, don't quote me on it, a bit of a turf war going on there, but that needs to be addressed. And then thirdly, I think this issue on impact's really important. I don't have the answer here, to be honest, because what we see, and something happened, I think it was a few months ago, there was an initiative to harmonize harmonization initiatives, which kind of really concerned me, that we have so many harmonization initiatives now that we need harmonization of those. So don't get me wrong, I don't think it's an easy thing to do. Again, different stakeholders will have different demands in terms of what they want to understand in terms of impact. So again, I think kind of looking at kind of core metrics, which are of interest to the wider majority of people. If you look at job creation, for example, I think there's two levels you can look at this. One is there's no excuse for no disclosure in publishing your methodology for calculating impact, so that those then who look at, if you like, job numbers or greenhouse gas avoided, et cetera, you can understand how they've got to that number. And then that will help you maybe look and say, okay, well, I can compare that to this other institution or I can't. So, there's no reason why you can't disclose kind of policies and methodologies. Then there's the issue around aligning, if you like, the methodology so that then the data is more comparable. And I think we probably need as a community to agree what the priority areas are. The obvious ones will be in kind of, I guess, the carbon footprint of the portfolio is an obvious one where there should be room for some kind of alignment and harmonization. With regard to all the other metrics, DFIs have lots of different objectives and their stakeholders want them to do different things. But job creation, I said, is a very important one. It's not good enough that DFIs just give you, we've created this many jobs. We want to know, well, who, the gender breakdown, the gender breakdown of that, what sectors kind of, what was the quality, is there a measure of job quality? What was kind of the average wage, et cetera, et cetera. So much more detailed information. So I'm not sure I've answered your question because I don't think it has any easy answers, which is why we are where we are. But I think we've got to be savvy about it, go for the low hanging fruit, get everyone up to a minimum standard, and then go from there.
Yeah, thanks. Indeed, it's a complex conversation. It has many dimensions, and when it comes to looking forward, we do have to bear some of the things that you flag in mind. Jeroen, and before giving you the floor, just to say that there has been some interesting comments and reflections in the Q&A box. And maybe I will abuse my capacity to flag some of these to you. I know that you have been thinking about some of the points flagging in the chat box with regards to the discussion that is going on at the moment at the OECD DAC. Some colleagues got very interested in the reflections that you, Jeroen, but also Samantha share in terms of the OECD DAC turning into the Wild West, with all these type of discussions about the redefinition of ODA. So in your final remarks, maybe you can share some of these, and we are getting very short of time. So sorry for the rush, but you do have the floor now.
Yeah, I guess on the Wild West comment, it's really in need of a sheriff, and that kind of, with the ability to enforce the rules. I mean, it's a voluntary reporting exercise that is based upon the goodwill of donors with a very minimal capacity among a secretariat to actually assess whether projects are good or not. So anyway, so on the question of risk transference, and I see there's one here also on leveraging private sector financial resources with ODA. I mean, this is, I'm of two minds on this. So I don't have any problem with utilizing guarantees, junior loans, any of these kinds of things for developmental purposes. I think that there's room for them. I think states should intervene in markets regularly and with gusto. That's my personal opinion. I don't buy that the CEC or the FMO are purveyors of neoliberalism and capitalism, because they are essentially public development banks that intervene in private markets. They may not admit this to themselves, but that is what they are, and that is how we should see them, and that is how we should use them. And I'm totally fine with that. Whether it's ODA is an entirely different question. But that once again has to do with, is ODA, as I think of it, even ODA anymore? On the question of risk mitigation, risk transference instruments, I mean, the argument is very compelling. We know that institutional investors are sitting on $80 trillion of capital, which they don't have anywhere to put except for maybe the housing market in the City of London or other areas. And then the idea there is that, well, maybe if we can use public money to de-risk this, they will then use this to invest in the global South. And wouldn't that be great for everyone if suddenly this 80 trillion was going into the development of markets and industry and infrastructure in the global South? And I can see why that is compelling to many decision makers. It's minimal cost. Guarantees generally do not get transferred to partner countries. They sit in an account unless they're called. I don't think the guarantee instrument of the IFC has ever been used. MIGA, I don't think it's ever been used. So there's clearly, low risk in terms of actually setting up these instruments. So it seems like a win-win situation. But counterintuitively, I mean, the lack of the low level of risk means that it's not working as effectively as it should. My personal opinion is that if guarantees were being used to their full developmental capacity, they should be being called left and right and regularly. Governments should be losing massive amounts of money as they try and determine how they can fix existing markets. And then the minute they're not being called, the government should get out of that, because if guarantees are not being called, then there's no problem where the investment is taking place. And that means that banks should be willing and able to take over the responsibility of guaranteeing private investment. So it is kind of it's almost nonsensical in terms of how the argument is structured, because we need to reduce risk in markets where there's too much risk. However, we are mostly going to de-risk projects that are happening in markets where there's not much risk, because we don't want to lose this ODA. It's that mix between civil servants being risk averse and then the desire to actually have some kind of financial target that you can have on supporting private sector investments. And that leads basically to bad projects. At least in my personal opinion, and not really the kind of good projects that we would like to see in least developed countries, where there's a real need for market intervention and support for small businesses in order to grow and flourish. And they could really benefit from these kinds of instruments if really targeted locally. But at the same time, a hammer is a hammer, an instrument is an instrument. It does some things well, and it doesn't do other things well. And we have to be very, very cognizant of what it can do effectively and what it can't do effectively. And my secondary concern is that the more complex you make ODA instruments, the more subject they are to abuse, and the more difficult they are for the public to understand. If you cannot explain how your intervention is going to help somebody in the country where you are intervening in very simple terms, then maybe you're doing the wrong thing. I think that's a very, very practical thing that goes into the point of having to establish a clear theory of change.
And with that, I think that you are closing your...
Just one last point on ODA. I mean, I think that there is now a discussion that needs to take place in the future of ODA. Guarantees is one discussion, but I think we should be opening it up. Maybe we should be talking about reparations. Maybe we should be talking about a kind of reverse debt owed by rich countries to poor countries. So it's not so much seen as charitable giving, but as a repayment for past grievances and existing grievances, and just restructuring the entire narrative. And then if ODA doesn't measure development assistance, then we don't need to use ODA. I mean, there's no reason we have to use it. There's nothing that says that ODA is the only metric for development assistance. It's just an easy one, and to date it has been somewhat practical in terms of actually demonstrating what donors are giving, and there's some legal requirements around it, but we don't have to do that. I mean, China said we're not going to do that, and they didn't. So, you know.
That's good as a final reflection, but I think that you are opening quite a big box towards the end, and maybe it's something that deserves a follow-up session, because I think that yes, there is a need to have this type of conversation in terms of how we will define ODA or aid, how we frame the discussion of aid looking forward, and we do not have enough time to go into these details now. But as I am trying to imply, there is a need to have follow-up discussions on this particular issue. EuroDAD, it's very much engaged into this issue, and we'll certainly invite you all in the next years to have other discussions on this topic. I just would like to thank you all for engaging into this conversation today, to all our speakers, Ricardo, Meja, Samantha, Jeroen, and also Adrian that could not join us. We would like to thank to our interpreters, to the EuroDAD team behind the scenes, to our donors, and as a reminder, this session will be publicly available, and you will hear about us and our work on this in the next months and years. So thank you very much. We really ran out of time, but we were very excited with everything that was shared today. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.